Yeah.
Hello, everyone. Greetings.
No.
As the inaugural director of the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies at the University of Toronto, I welcome you all to today's special event featuring my distinguished colleague, Professor Dominic Parviz Brookshaw of Oxford University, who will be speaking on a family of poets and a family of patrons, networks of riderly kinship in early Qajar Iran. Professor Brookshaw, thank you for accepting our invitation and joining us in person at the University of Toronto. We look forward to the publication of your forthcoming book.
Thank you.
And you will be back here again soon, hopefully.
No doubt.
Yeah. I want to thank our co-sponsors, the Canadian Society for Iranian and Persian Studies, the Iranian Studies Student Forum, the Roshan Cultural Heritage Institute for sponsoring today's event. We are particularly thankful to Roshan Cultural Heritage Institute and Dr. Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali for their generous support of the Institute of Iranian Studies at the University of Toronto. At the outset, and before introducing our speaker, I also like to express our individual and collective gratitude to Canada's Indigenous people and acknowledge this land on which the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of Credit River. Today, this meeting place continues to be the home to many Indigenous people across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to live, learn, and teach on their ancestral homeland. My colleague, Dr. Abulfaz Moshiri, a postdoctoral fellow for the Women Poets Iranica Research Compendium, will introduce Professor Brookshaw and will moderate today's session.
With pleasure. Thank you very much. Dr. Dominic Parviz Brookshaw, welcome to Toronto, to Tehran, and it's a pleasure to have you. Dr. Brookshaw is professor of Persian literature and Iranian culture in the Faculty of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies at University of Oxford and senior research fellow in Persian at Wadham College, Oxford. He currently serves as president of the Association for Iranian Studies, AIS, and his accolades and publications are simply too many to mention here today. But among my favorites is a chapter titled, "Have You Heard the One About the Man from Ghazvin? Regionalist Humor in the Works of Obaid Zakani," and the volume edited by Dr. Brookshaw himself titled "Ruse and Wits, the Humorous in Arabic, Persian, and Turkish Narratives," published by Harvard University Press in 2012. His latest book, titled "Hafiz and His Contemporaries, Poetry, Performance, and Patronage in 14th Century Iran," won the prestigious award, Saeed Sirjani Book Award in 2020. His forthcoming monograph, titled "Center, Periphery, and Gender, Poetic Resurgence in Early Qajar Iran," will be published hopefully this year, 2025?
Next year.
2026 then, by University of Michigan Press, and we're looking forward to it. And I think the talk today is somehow related to that forthcoming project. It is worth mentioning that Dr. Brookshaw has also a Canadian connection, as he was a lecturer many years ago, and a lecturer of Persian at McGill University in Montreal, 2005 to 2007. Without further ado, welcome to Toronto, and the floor is yours, Dr. Brookshaw.
Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to come here. Thank you very much to Professor Tawakkoli. Thank you to Dr. Moshiri for the wonderful introduction. Thank you to everyone who's come in person. There are a lot of people in this room, and everyone who's come online. I am presenting today part of one of the chapters from the book that I'm completing. And this chapter looks at the female networks, which were in a way kind of that came out of the royal networks of poetry that were happening at the court of Fath Ali Shah, but are somehow intersect with it, but are also kind of adjacent to it. And this idea of maybe not, at least in this chapter, although the book generally does a kind of social history of poetry in the early Qajar period from below, but this is also a kind of history from beside, as it were. So people of course, rank and importance, and we'll see that today in the poetry that I'm going to share with you, but people who, because of their gender, because of the various strictures around women writing, even commissioning, and perhaps also being praised in poetry, are not central to the kind of royal court project of poetry in that period. So that whole period from the late 18th and coming to its fruition in the early 19th century and later on all the way to really the constitutional period is the period that is now called the Bozgasht Adabi, the literary return movement that began, of course, earlier in the 18th century, in the mid-18th century. And most people take that back to Isfahan and a circle of poets who were kind of, if you can say, poets of poets. They were writing primarily for each other because patronage was not what it perhaps had been for many centuries. They had some local patrons, but they really wrote a lot of poetry in praise of one another, and they took a lot of inspiration from one another. But what happened with Fath Ali Shah, so the second Qajar king, coming to power and then really developing Tehran as a royal capital in so many different ways, one of the key things that he did, because of his own interest in poetry, because he was a poet himself of some merit, but obviously it seems that he and then the people close to him, whether they were his relatives, his sons primarily, but also daughters, or whether they were the men of state of the day, thought it very important that there be a large number and a growing number of poets at court, primarily to praise him, of course, but also to engage in really what is a kind of literary revival. It's not something that is studied, has been studied greatly. It's studied a bit more, of course, in Persian than in other languages. So it's an understudied period in general. But what we have from that period in terms of studies of poetry really only focuses on poetry written by men, in praise of men, at the royal court in Tehran. It really doesn't spread out in terms of the scholarship beyond that. And hopefully my book will do that, primarily by thinking about the broader project, primarily by looking, as the title suggests, at the periphery in various ways and understood in various ways. So looking at ethnic minorities, I focus on Kurdistan, poetry written in Persian, but in Kurdistan. Looking at people who are from heterodox religious communities, so the Nemat Elahé Sufi community, but also the Babi movement and the Babi community, and how those also intersect with one another. And then looking at the center, but at women poets and female patrons, and how they perhaps help us understand some of the dynamics that were happening at the real kind of center with the male poets at the court. So anyway, today, what I'm going to try and do is give you a taste of that female-centered elite environment for the production of poetry, the commissioning of poetry, and the appreciation of poetry in Tehran in the 18-teens, 1820s. I think that patronage and poetry production networks such as these should be read as evidence of a female-centered literary tradition that really was very vibrant, I think, even in this early Qajar period. And as I said, it was one that was in dialogue with and intersected with the male-dominated kind of, real center of things. The ways in which female poets appear to have both created a space for themselves, but also been nurtured by both male and female patrons, helped to create what Sunil Sharma, looking at the kind of broad history of female poets in the Persephone sphere, has talked about a kind of sisterhood of poets, a sisterhood of female poets. And I think you see this when you start to look carefully at the anthologies in particular, and the most important of those is the female-only anthology of 1825, written by Mahmud Mirza, who I'll talk about in a moment. But really looking at the anthologies and then the divans, and of course a lot of the divans of these female poets have been lost or only survive in fragmentary form or perhaps in a single manuscript. And of course we know all of the reasons around why there's this kind of attrition in women's writing. And it continues, of course, well into the 20th century. But in this early period, you know, the fact that we have the anthology of 1825, the Nokhl-e Majlis by Mahmud Mirza, is really this, although it's a very brief work, is a repository, and it gives you this wonderful snapshot of what was happening between women, amongst women, but also how some of these women poets and these patrons were interacting with male poets, interacting with male patrons, and therefore had a connection to this broader, kind of more central and centralized network. So Farzand Milani has talked about how women writers, looking at the kind of long kind of history of things, but thinking about the 19th century, I think, when she says this, saying that she says women writers had to transgress feminine proprieties that shut them out of the public domain. They had to expose their voices because literature transmits and translates the human voice to the printed page. Writing, like unveiling, makes a woman publicly visible and mobile. And naturally, she then says, it could not be included in the repertoire of proper behavior for women. Instead, it was a closely defined filial activity passed down from fathers to sons. Now, I would agree with the first part of that statement, but when we start to really look and do a kind of literary archaeology, you actually find that there are women who are passing on this talent that they had, and not in a surreptitious or a kind of covert, secret way, to not only their daughters, but interestingly also to their sons, and that's something that I will come back to. I think it's quite clear, and I've published on this, but I think it's quite clear from these texts that, in fact, this was seen both producing poetry, but also learning to appreciate poetry, learning to appreciate how poetry works in a technical sense, but also having an appreciation of the kind of, as it was understood at the time, the canon of Persian poetry. These were all things that actually were within the repertoire of proper education for women at the time. Now, Fath Ali Shah's daughters and a good number of his wives as well were literate, and they were encouraged to express themselves, of course, within the parameters and within the kind of framework of poetry as it was understood at the time, but they were encouraged to express themselves in writing. One of the things that's fascinating about Nokhl-e Majlis, about that anthology from 1825, is that the contemporary women that are talked about, and he, of course, as you would expect, Mahmud Mirza divides his anthology based on status, and there's a hierarchy, so you get the royal women first, and then you get the women who are non-royal but have these connections very often to royal circles, but who are living or are near contemporaries to the 1820s. And then he ends with a kind of historical overview of medieval and early modern female poets. Again, something I'll mention in a moment. But he introduces all of these female poets by their pen name. He doesn't introduce them by their given name on the whole, and he doesn't introduce them where they do have a laqab, where they do have a regal title. He doesn't normally use that unless they also use that as their pen name. And what that shows is that he is presenting and encouraging the reader to interact with these women as poets, not to interact with them as the princesses or the wives of the Shah that they are, or even these women who are in that category of being non-royal but kind of professional or semi-professional poets. He doesn't want you to interact with them as the wife of someone, although he does explain that, of course, or the daughter of someone necessarily. He introduces them by their pen name, and he gives them that credit, and he is asking his readers, who up until that point he had written himself a number of really important anthologies of male poets, of contemporary male poets. And this short text, which was commissioned by his sister, who I'll talk about in a moment, is a continuation of that work that he was doing of anthologizing the poetry that he saw around him being created across Iran, but also very much at the royal court at the center. And this was a small kind of limited foray into the female tradition as he observed it. But he presents them in the same way that he presents male poets. The slightly later Tazkira Kharabat, or the Tazkira of Kharab Qajar, Holaku Mirza, is very interesting because it's near in time. It's in the 1840s, probably late 1840s. But in that, we already have a Tazkira that incorporates female poets alongside male poets. So just within a generation of Noghla Majlis, about 20-something years later, we have an integration of the two, and there, again, these female poets are presented by their pen name. Of course, he takes most of his information and most of his examples from Noghla Majlis, I mean, in the tradition of Tazkira writing, where people not quite plagiarize, but recycle, borrow, that's right, and we have examples today as well, but borrow material and represent it for their new readers. But there you already have this coming together of male and female poets, but again by pen name, and that's really significant. The poetry I want to talk to you about is today, most of it, is poetry of panegyric, poetry of praise. There is a lot of work on Arabic and Persian praise poetry, Julie Maysami, also Stetkevich, Grundler, a number of important female scholars within our broader field have written a lot about the power of panegyric, whether in Arabic or Persian, and really have done a lot of work to, I think, demystify the genre. In particular, they're talking about qasida poetry, of long praise poetry, but of course panegyric in Persian almost from the very beginning also appeared in ghazal form, even with Sana'i and perhaps even earlier. And the examples I'll show you today are ghazal, but panegyric ghazal. Those scholars have done a lot of work to kind of rehabilitate the study of and the reading of qasida in particular, but also panegyric in general, and made it a kind of viable focus for younger researchers, and an area in which I think Persian literary studies also needs to develop and perhaps catch up maybe with studies of classical Arabic. But looking at panegyric as something that is not simply about a kind of hollow, sycophantic praise of an individual, but really as a model, kind of mirror in a way for emulation, something to aspire to, something that is presented to the public as it's understood within that broader court context. And the feminine panegyric, but also written by female poets for their female patrons, is a really interesting area because these poems so often play on masculine tropes and established ways of praising powerful men, but they're used to praise these incredibly powerful, within their context, women. It's important, of course, to remember that the harem of Fath Ali Shah was an enormous institution. You know, at any one time, hundreds of women, if not maybe 1,000, were present within it in some way or other. And of course, it represented people from the lowest to the highest social status, right? It had a lot of slaves, a lot of owned people, but then it also had the important wives of the Shah, and then also his mother at some point, etc. So within that context, if you think about the panegyrics that I'm going to show you being presented even within a kind of feminocentric, a gynocentric situation, by a female poet, for a female patron, to a female audience, it could be an audience of a considerable number of people, right? And as we know, these harems are not sealed spaces. People came in and people came out. People visited, you know, whether the women of a higher social status would visit their relatives within the harem and then return to other parts of the city, other parts of Iran. And there were also women of low social status coming in and out to service the harem. So you have the possibility that a text like Noghl-e Majlis from the 1820s could, in probably very much in an oral form, but also to a certain extent in a written form, could easily circulate out within the palace and within that broader kind of royal network, but also outside and beyond that. There are even references, and colleagues here who are historians will verify this, in histories such as Tarikh Zul-Qarnayn, which is really important for information for political history, but also information on princes and princesses of royal blood. There are a number of places in there where Khavari, the historian, the writer, says that he was asked to compose a poem, and there's one instance where he composes for one of the women I'm going to talk about, a poem that she asks him to write. And then he says, you know, hundreds of copies of this, because she liked the poem, were made and were distributed amongst the women of the harem. It tells you something about the literacy of the women in the harem, but it also is just this tiny window into the idea that these texts could really circulate very easily. Of course, in a period in which many people, not just women but also men, were illiterate, poetry, we know, circulated regardless of literacy. You know, these are texts that can be easily memorized by people within a culture that still has such a focus on orality. So I want to, if this works or doesn't work, to move to the next slide. But I'm not sure if that's, sorry. While we're working out how to do that. How did you do that? It will do it now? Okay. I wanted us to look at one of the patron herself that I'm going to talk about, the one that the female poet, who I will introduce slightly later, is writing for. So this is and unfortunately I've imposed myself onto the there. Much better. This is a portion of an short autobiographical masnavi that is written by Zia al-Saltana, who is the 7th daughter of Fath Ali Shah, and perhaps, according to the sources at the time, seems to have been his most influential and therefore most powerful. After his death, perhaps his wealthiest daughter. She's famous for not having married and refusing suitors, and only marrying under duress and force when Muhammad Shah told her to marry, and he married her, or she accepted to marry the Minister of Foreign Affairs. She didn't want to marry her cousins. She's interesting in relation to poetry because she is the one that commissions the Noghl-e Majlis, the female-only anthology, in 1825 from her full brother, Mahmud Mirza. She is interesting also because she apparently is the one that would read poems that were submitted to Fath Ali Shah, presumably not the poetry that is coming from his court panegyrists who would be in his employ, but I guess if someone sent a poem to Fath Ali Shah, she would read it to him. She also is said to have recorded his poetry. And it's her brother, Mahmud Mirza, who is instrumental in the first printing of the divan of his father. So perhaps she also had a hand in that, because she had been collecting some of this poetry. So she's obviously interested in poetry. She also was a very good calligrapher, perhaps a better calligrapher than a poet. But this poem is really interesting because it is, as I said, to a certain extent, autobiographical. And she talks about herself as herself, right? But she begins with Manabande. I'll read a translation of what you can see in Persian. Even though I am the Shah's daughter, and my crown brushes the moon from pride, and all that I could desire is provided, whether carpets and clothes or jewels and gold, horses and camels, female and male servants or slaves, as well as flocks, herds and livestock, and I have abundant jewelry, so much that it cannot be counted. I have not bound my heart to any of these, for it is very difficult to detach one's heart. So the Masnavi is autobiographical. The point of the Masnavi is to say that I am a detached from worldly goods. And she goes on to say how detached she is, and how at the end of, there's a kind of flourish at the end of the poem where she calls on Fatima to assist her and to make her kind of succeed in her mystical quest to be an ascetic and all that kind of thing. But it's an interesting poem in the sense that she is showing, and boasting of course, but showing an awareness of her privilege, but at the same time kind of drawing back from it in a way. One of the things that Zia al-Saltana also did was to patronize the most significant female poet of her day. And that poet was Rashha Isfahani, or Rashha Kashani, who is the daughter of Hatif Isfahani. So Hatif Isfahani, everyone knows, but really is the most talented, most important poet of the second half of the 18th century. He dies in the early 1780s, I think, 1783, 1784, something like that. So Rashha, we don't know her birth date, we don't know her death date. She seems to have been alive in 1825. She probably was then, at that time that the anthology is written, probably a woman in her 50s or so. She's writing for Zia al-Saltana, who at that point was about 24 or 25 years of age. So she's writing for a patron who is half her age, which is an interesting proposition. Of course, it's something that very famously Hafez, at the end of his life, was writing for patrons who were very, very young. So it's something with a precedent in Persian literary history. In any case, Rashha, whose name means sprinkling, or sprinkling of rain, is a poet that is definitely very talented, but her poetry has only survived, as far as we know, in this anthology that was commissioned by Zia al-Saltana and collected by the brother Mahmud Mirza. It has not. There is a reference from the 1920s, 1930s to someone having seen her divan, which is meant to be 3,000 baits of poetry, but it presumably was only ever in a single copy, and whether it exists or not, in Iran somewhere, hopefully at some point someone will find it. She had a more famous brother, Sahab Isfahani, who was one of the really important panegyrists of the very early Fath Ali Shah period. You know, one of the things that, you know, very often the comparison is made between what Fath Ali Shah was doing and Mahmud of Ghazna did in the early 11th century by bringing poets to his court and paying for them and lavishing patronage upon them. And what the royal court did in Tehran, by and large, was to bring the poets of Isfahan, of Kashan, to Tehran, right? And the case of Sahab and his sister Rashha is another one of those examples. Not only are they bringing them geographically from Isfahan, Kashan, and those regions, but they're also, by bringing Sahab to the court, Fath Ali Shah in a way is kind of co-opting and bringing the legacy of Hatif Isfahani, who was so important already in his day and certainly by the early 19th century. Bringing the son there gave a kind of additional gravitas to the royal literary circle. Rashha writes poetry for Zia al-Saltana, and I'll show you hopefully, I still don't know how to do that. Oh, down here. Yep. Now look, I learned how to do that. Incredible. Here you can see, I tried to represent, and I couldn't make this diagram myself. My wife made it for me, so I have to credit my wife for making it.
Great job.
And my elder daughter helped me with the PowerPoint as well. So. Yes. So you can see here, if you look at the red line is parent-child blood relationship. So Fath Ali Shah, and then these three, of course, many of his older children wrote poetry and are recorded as having written poetry. But Mahmud Mirza, although a poet himself, is really important as a writer of anthologies. He has a number of important anthologies and also a history as well, and he has a travelogue, and he wrote about 20 different works. His full sister, one of his full sisters, Zia al-Saltana, who's in the middle there, and then one of his full brothers. There were 2 sisters and 4 brothers from the same mother, one of the Jewish wives of Fath Ali Shah, Maryam Khanum. But these 3, who are full siblings, were also quite important as patrons of poetry. Rashha is there in the middle, because I'm going to show you some of her poetry in a moment. And you can see that relationship, of course, to Hatif from the 18th century, to Sahab. Sahab really primarily appears to really have only or primarily praised Fath Ali Shah rather than any princes in particular, but that was the focus of his panegyrics. Rashha has panegyric for Fath Ali Shah, it seems. She alludes to it at least, and perhaps also for Humayun Mirza, but she definitely has for Zia al-Saltana and Mahmud Mirza. Kushta Kashani, her son, Rashha's son, was the Nadim, was the boon companion and poet and kind of poetic buddy of Humayun Mirza. And Mahmud Mirza says at one point in his anthology that Rashha's entree into this royal circle that allowed her to write poetry for Fath Ali Shah primarily came from her son being the Nadim of Humayun Mirza. So that really assisted her. But of course her lineage, her relationship to her brother, but also the lineage and the legacy of Hatif Isfahani cannot be ignored. But I've tried to show some of the likely patronage relationships and the actual ones between Rashha and these other people. The 3 figures below Rashha, who are in italics, are interesting because they are female poets of earlier periods. And they are poets, and there are a couple of others as well, that Mahmud Mirza compares Rashha to and says that she surpasses them in eloquence. The interesting thing is that Mahsati, who also features in his anthology, is of course best known for her rather bawdy and naughty poetry, and is probably 12th century. Lale Khatun, who is Padishah Khatun, is a royal woman who wrote some poetry, but was also a patron of poets in the late 13th century. And Mehri here is Mehri Heravi, who is a Timurid period poet and companion of Gohar Shad. But Mahmud Mirza makes this claim, as he does very often about male poets who are living at the time as well, that they surpass the poets of the past. And of course the project that they're involved in is a project not only of reviving and imitating, but attempting to challenge and create poems that are better than poets of the past. So you would expect him to say such a thing. But I think some of her poetry is quite interesting. I have to move myself again. Sorry. If I had known, I would have made a little box for myself in the PowerPoint. Yeah. I could have just left myself in the PowerPoint box. So this is one of those poems in praise of Zia al-Saltana by Rashha. Again, I'll read you my translation of this poem. O Zia al-Saltana, O mistress round whom the world pivots, O you from whose face the splendor of kingly good fortune beams. Wherever you reside, every one of the heavens is made to blush. Wherever you abide, every one of the worlds derives dignity. Before the tent of your glory, the canopy of the heavens hangs low. Before the sun of your beauty, the face of the sun turns dark. The earth finds inner peace when it leans against her wisdom. Heaven's wheel spins by virtue of being struck by her resolve. The one through whom the palace of unbelief and debasement was destroyed, the one through whom the lot of the realm and the people has been made firm. I mean, this is very much, of course, in the style of male panegyric, right? Apart from the fact that we know the identity of Zia al-Saltana, there isn't very much in here that you can necessarily identify as being feminine, right? What is interesting about in terms of the form of the poem, it is one in its meter and rhyme. There is a very, very long lineage for this form. So you can find poems going all the way back to the medieval period that this poem is somehow drawing on, and you can find commonalities between them. But I wanted us to look a little bit at this Banuye Giti Madar, the woman who makes the world turn, or is the pivot around which the world turns, or is at the center of this spinning world. Now, this is something that, if we simply look at Qajar period poetry, is said about Fath Ali Shah himself. And so Qa'ani has a poem in which he talks about Khusro Giti Madar in reference to Fath Ali Shah. Reza Qoli Khan Hidayat talks about Fath Ali Shah as being Shahan Shah Giti Madar. So when Rashha changes this to Banuye Giti Madar, I mean, she really is making this equivalence between the daughter and the favorite daughter and Fath Ali Shah. That this woman is not simply someone of status, but someone at the center, at least, of the kind of female part of this royal setup and royal project. In addition to that, you find also in, and I'll come to that a bit later, you find in contemporary and slightly later religious poetry references to the imams with this Giti Madar as well. And so at one point the Imam Ali is referred to as Nayyere Giti Madar. And this is something that Rashha does repeatedly, over and over again. There's of course a play on the idea of Ziya al-Saltana, where she says Ziya Dolat Shahi Zeruyat Ashakar, that Ziya meaning light or luminescence or orb in a way, and playing on that, that's something again that you find Ziya Dolatuddin in medieval panegyric. But again, this Zeruyat al-Shakar is found I found a poem by Mullah Ahmad al-Naraqi, which is in praise of Imam Hussein, in which he says, Ay Jamal Haq Zeruyat al-Shakar. And it is contemporary with Rashha. Now, religious poetry, of course, was really important in the Safavid period. It continues to be important. It is called the importance of Hatif Isfahani as the devotional aspect of his poetry. And so it's really interesting to see that, and you see it, I think, in a way more with Rashha than you do with Sahab, but you see that the use of poetry for Shi'i devotion being not manipulated, but being reused by Rashha in these panegyrics for Ziya al-Saltana. That she is bringing to them a kind of religious sensibility. That is very much clear in the last line where she talks about the Kach Kufr u Zillat is going to be destroyed. Anke az veyaf Kach Kufr u Zillat enhedam. This idea of the Kach Kufr being destroyed is again something that is repeatedly used in relation to the imams. So this is, again, a poem in terms of its form, in terms of its meter, is of an anticipated and expected model in a way, right? Let's look at the next one. This is not the full poem. The full poem is 9 baits, and I've just given you the last 5 here. So it's slightly longer. Again, not really a qasida. It's more a more lengthy panegyric, and the name of the patron is coming at the end rather than the beginning, of course, again from fairly early on in the medieval period, and Hafez then later also does this repeatedly, where he does sometimes start the poem with mention of the patron as well as end it. In this one at least, it comes in its normal place at the end of the poem. This is one that has precedent, not as much as the other one in terms of form. But there are some interesting Qajar resonances with the poem. Again, I'll read my translation of what I've given you there, these last lines of the poem. You stabbed me with a blade of cruelty. Alas, the only sin I have committed is to have carried the burden of your brutality upon my shoulders. My cup of delight has never been emptied of the poison of your grief, ever since the moment I sipped the wine of your kindness. What now does Rashha gain from the sprinkling of the cloud of her benevolence, since the lightning of her grief has already charred the field of my hope? Since I have lost myself in the cup of love, what need have I for wine? When I am dizzy through praising the king, why should I drink wine? Zia al-Saltana, the lady of this age, about whom heaven says, before her door I have bowed myself in prostration. And I read that at the end as the sepeh, the heavens speaking themselves and saying what they have done, which mirrors the behavior of Rashha. Sahab, whose pen name means clouds, has an unfinished, he died fairly young, an unfinished tazkira, which is called Rashahat Sahab, where he takes his sister's pen name that maybe he gave to her and pluralizes it and then uses his own pen name. So the kind of multiple sprinklings of the clouds is the name of his anthology. But this emphasis on the idea of sepeh and of abr, kunun ze rizesh abr atash, she says here. This idea of the abr is also somehow making Sahab present in her poem. Some of the resonances from Qajar poetry, from Mohit Qomi, who is later, but an interesting poet because he has a very strong, of course, connection to clerical and ulama circles, but also to royal circles, including to Zia al-Saltana. He has a poem in praise of Imam Baqir, where he talks about having, he says, as an zaman ke ze la'alat sharab shouq cheshidam, from that moment in which, from that merry moment since I tasted the wine of ecstatic longing from your ruby lips. This is for Imam Baqir. But this kind of erotic use of ghazal, not only as panegyric, but also panegyric for the imams, is something that comes up again in these poems. Again, for Imam Baqir, Mohit Qomi says, "Ke mast bade ishq shaham, na mast nabidam," which is kind of what she's saying here, that I am drunk on the passionate love of my king, meaning the imam. I'm not drunk on wine itself. And so she says here, what need do I have for wine when I'm drunk on the praise that I am producing? But again, showing that connection between religious devotional poetry, an awareness of the longer canon of panegyric, of courtly panegyric, but then feminizing it. This Khatun Ruzagar is also really interesting. You can imagine it being used about Fatima, for example. I mean, it has a very kind of eschatological quality to it. And as we know, there was a lot of fervor in the early part of the 19th century from various communities around this idea of the coming of the Day of Judgment, of Qiyamat, etc. So a final poem. This again is using ghazal in order, or as a vehicle for praise. And as in the previous poem, Rashha is bemoaning her situation, and in the tradition of the poet looking for favor and looking for reward and looking, of course, for monetary recompense for their hard work, is talking like the lover who's been jilted. If my moon left in anger, she has returned out of kindness. Thanks be to God that my morning sighs provided the remedy. In love's realm, how can we distinguish masterhood from servitude? Observe Sultan Mahmud and how he became enslaved to Ayaz. A blessed heavenly voice delivered this good news into my ear last night, as my eyes opened once more from grief-stricken slumber. O Rashha, live joyfully, for the auspicious steps of your king have opened doors of joy before every one of your woes. That is Ziya, whose wrath has become all-consuming and whose abundant favor soothes every heart. She's talking here about Ziya al-Saltana as though she is the king herself. Now we know that the princes of the royal blood sometimes wrote about themselves, referred to themselves, and are referred to in poetry with Shah, right? Instead of being Mahmud Mirza, you find Mahmud Shah quite often, and the other more important princes as well. But here there is the suggestion that this woman can become the Shah and has that importance for and bearing on at least Rashha's life that is similar. This poem doesn't seem to have much connection with earlier poetry in terms of its form, in terms of its meter and its rhyme. Though I did find a connection to a poem by Qajar Isfahani from the 13th century, where he's talking about the desire and, in a way, presenting it as a burden, the intense desire to present praise at the threshold of the patron. And when he does that, he said, "Busid astano du'a gofto bazgasht," that it was too much to even enter the presence of the patron. He just presented it, he gave du'a, he gave prayers for the good fortune, which obviously is part of the qasida itself, and then kissed the threshold and retreated. And so there's this, which is the way in which he talks about the return of the beloved patron at the beginning. It's an interesting kind of connection between the two. So if I have a couple of minutes, I'll give some conclusions on what I think is happening with these, this woman poet in particular and a female patron. In spite of the freedom that women poets enjoyed regarding gendered comparisons in their poetry, and we see some of that, the poems of Rashha in praise of Ziya al-Saltana are, for the most part, indistinguishable from those penned by, say, Sabah, Kashani, and Qa'ani for women of the royal harem, and there are a number of them. One might be tempted to argue that poems composed by female poets in the framework of an intra-clan female-female dynamic would bear the mark of a degree of verisimilitude not found in poetry composed by men in praise of the same women. The female poet would have interacted much more freely with her female patron, would have seen her unveiled, for example. What we find, however, is a great deal of overlap between the female-authored and the male-authored poems. And I think this is because poets such as Rashha, who were taken seriously as panegyrists during their own lifetime, consciously imitated the leading male poets of their day, a fact that perhaps explains the emphasis on chastity and the veil found in female-authored poetry, that they don't want to overstep their mark. They want to imitate the men, but they want to remain chaste as women at the same time. By imitating male panegyrists of the past and of their own time, female poets engaged in what Stetkevich has called the reciprocal validation and authorization of the imitated and the imitator. She goes on to argue that through the use of the panegyric ode as a literary genre, the full weight of the tradition comes to bear on the confirmation of the poet's authority and equally on the patron's authority as ruler, or, as in this case, an important daughter of the Shah. It's interesting when you look at Qa'ani's poetry in praise of some of these same women, that there doesn't seem to have been a taboo on them praising the physical beauty of their royal subjects. But having said that, Qa'ani would not have seen the women that he's praising unveiled. So it's a slightly odd activity, but nonetheless it's there, and it's something that I think Rashha in this poem and in the previous one is drawing on. Whilst remaining mindful of the impulse on the part of female poets to emulate their male peers, it's important not to overlook women's networks of poetry production, performance, and patronage. Through female networks facilitated by Qajar literary matriarchy, performance contexts will open up to female poets that were largely off-limits to males. A small number of women wrote for other women in Qajar Iran, and they recited their poetry for often large women-only audiences. audiences, as I've said earlier, who would have transmitted selected verses and perhaps even whole short poems such as this. And their positive impression of the women poets that they encountered, they would have transmitted that far beyond the female-only majales into the domestic spaces and thereby to their menfolk. So we can see these networks, these female networks, ultimately kind of linking up to, and especially in the case of Rashha, she's writing this poetry while her brother was still alive, linking up to his male networks in a way that perhaps is lost if we only look at these female poets as female poets separate somehow from the male tradition. I think I'll probably stop there so that we can have some questions. I look forward to your questions, your critiques, and your feedback. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Brookshaw, for an illuminating and interesting talk about one of the less studied period of Iranian poetry, especially female poetry. The floor is open for questions. If you're online, you can unmute yourself or type your questions. And if you're in person, you can just raise your hands.
Well, thank you very much for such a wonderful, for sharing this project. I know you partly addressed to my question, but I would like to know how you would distinguish Zia al-Saltana's poetry or poetic writing compared to her brothers, because they also vastly contributed to the royal poetic writing. Or if there is, if it's legitimate even to compare it, if you think we can compare it, if we can compare them, how would you compare Zia al-Saltana to her siblings, especially her brothers? I would like to know. Yeah,
it's a good question. I mean, one of the problems, and the problem with Zia al-Saltana's poetry, is that her poetry, by and large, has only survived in that anthology. There are a few other poems that are attributed to her that are not in the anthology. There's at least one in the tazkiras Kharabat, which is not in Noql Majlis, and there is another poem which interestingly has a link potentially to a poem attributed to Tahireh Quratul Ain, that is a version of which is also by Zia al-Saltana. But there's not enough poetry by her to be able to do that kind of comparison, I would say. Having said that, the autobiographical, at least in part, Masnavi, at least in the way in which it's presented, is very, very interesting. I mean, it's, if you read mid to late 20th century authors writing in Persian in Iran, they will tell you that there is nothing personal in any of this poetry from the 19th century, and that there is nothing personal until you get to the 20th century. If you read it carefully, I mean, that's a very obvious example, but if you read it carefully, there's quite a lot that is, at least in the way that they would have understood, personal. Just as we have to kind of, I think, and again, there are people in this room who have done much more work on this than I have, but just as we have to reconceptualize public and reconceptualize private, we also have to reconceptualize personal. And personal through the literary idiom is again another kind of challenge, especially as we look from our perspective now backwards. But that poem in which she boasts about her wealth, and then by extension boasts about her piety, is itself an autobiographical and kind of personal reflection. So you can imagine if we do find more poetry by her, that it could be even more interesting for the poetry that then does emerge by the late 19th, early 20th century by women.
Thank you so much for your fantastic conclusion. I was wondering whether you could share some comparative approaches to your project. For example, like how this Iranian women's poetry and their network is special compared to the broader Middle Eastern women's literature or something similar in world literature.
I mean, thinking comparatively of contemporary networks, I think it's more kind of possible to think to a certain extent about Ottoman poetry, but we could also, within a more kind of like, for want of a better term, Persianate sphere, to think about what is happening in Central Asia. And there are a number of women poets who are important in the Central Asian context around the same time or slightly later. And what is happening at court is similar to what these women are doing. So it's not an isolated situation. I think comparatively for me, at least for my project that I'm doing, I have looked within Iran, but looked at, as I mentioned, these other communities that are somehow adjacent to the royal court, and are very often thought as being somehow very separate from it, but in fact are demonstrating, whether it's in the poetry of women or the poetry of men, very similar behaviors and interactions with the canon, but also similar behaviors around use of praise poetry, how they integrate either praise poetry for devotional purposes or use devotional poetry in a praise manner. And you can find that, or I have found that, and I will be presenting in the book examples from so regional courts that are obviously imitating what is happening at the center, but also, as I mentioned, in these two heterodox religious communities. Because the Sufis, the Ne'matolahi Sufis, are doing much of this work before it becomes kind of central royal practice in relation to how they reuse, reinterpret Hafiz and Sa'di, for example, and also Maulana and also Rumi. But also the Babi poets, who are even more, you would think, separate from temporal power, are using poetry in ways that is very similar and often somehow intersecting what is happening in royal networks, because these women very often had connections that went across royal networks, Ne'matolahi networks, and Babi networks. And they spoke to each other very often through poetry. So comparatively, I think if you think closer to home, there is a lot of similar behaviors in networks that you could be forgiven for thinking were very separate from one another, or were somehow very different, but they're actually really quite similar.
Thank you.
Professor Brookshaw, thank you for your fascinating presentation. And reflecting on this family of poets and family of patrons, I'm wondering whether you can also talk about the family of readers.
Mm-hmm.
And as you talk about the writerly kinship, whether there was a parallel readerly kinship.
Presumably there was. I mean, we unfortunately, I don't think, know enough about who was reading what, beyond doing that kind of archaeology where you look at what they're producing, and then of course you can kind of understand what they're drawing on and where that might be coming from. So, for example, one of the poets that I've looked at who is writing in Sanandaj in Kurdistan is one of the other daughters of Fath Ali Shah, Valiya. And quite often in her poetry, I can see resonances of earlier Ne'matolahi poetry or of some court poetry. Now, she moved in the 1820s, when she got married, from Tehran to Sanandaj. It would seem that she perhaps had access to some of these things that she's been reading in Tehran, in the Royal Library. And then she takes that with her, in a sense, whether she took it physically or whether she takes it in terms of what she's read, and then she starts writing poetry. She takes that to Sanandaj, because the poetry that we have by her is poetry written in Kurdistan. But I think you can see in her poetry that she's been drawing on a big library, not on the small one that they would have had. So there's that kind of writing, reading practices which are somehow related to family networks, right?
And the way you're describing it, you have the overlapping of writerly and readerly.
Yes.
That is, you read and you write.
Yes.
What I'm sort of thinking maybe the audience for the writing of the poets in the majlis that they gathered.
Sure.
Could it go beyond? Did it go beyond this family of patrons?
I think
and
it.
Poets.
I think it
And
did.
sort of a semi-public of
Sure.
some sort.
Well, I mean, if you look at that Nogle Majlis, so he introduces the poets by their pen name, but then he tells you exactly who they are. I mean, sometimes slightly cryptically, but he tells you, you know, obviously that it's if it's the royal women, it's the daughter of the king, but married to so-and-so, or is the mother of this person, and was living here and then lived there. So you know exactly who the person is, even if sometimes they're not named by their either given name or sometimes if they have laqab. And that shows you that this is not written simply for people of the family itself, because they all knew who everyone was, right? You needed to, so that you didn't end up marrying your half sibling or something. So, I mean, you know, it wasn't like they needed the identity of these poets to be explained to them. So immediately the impetus for writing that anthology has to be one that is beyond its immediate context of production, right? Because Mahmud Mirza is not only saying, well, these are poets and I'm going to present them by their pen name, but he is telling you exactly who they are in relation to other people, primarily, of course, in relation to powerful men. But he's situating them. But he's situating them for people who are outside of that immediate context, so that it can travel, so that it can be read more widely. Oh.
Thank you.
Yes. There are two questions online. Would you mind if I read them first and then we come to, yeah. So one of them is rather an interest of a person. Manik Bujwala asks what happened to, so you talked about other communities, Babis, but Kurdistan also, Azerbaijan, whether there were any Zoroastrian female or male poet for that matter in that time. And the second question by Karen Pinto is, she says that if you could share your opening poem, because it seems that she is complaining about life despite having a luxurious life. And what was the, she also says that whether, she says cocaine, but I think she means opium. So what was the relationship of having substance use and in relation to reciting poetry? But there was any relation, or was it only a male kind of thing, or whether female would also use either opium or wine, for example?
So the first question was for Zoroastrian, yeah. So there, as far as I know, I haven't come across female Zoroastrian poets in this period at all. There are male ones, but I think they're also, by and large, slightly later. But it doesn't mean that they weren't writing poetry, of course. It just means that they don't make their way until slightly later into other anthologies. So there are anthologies from Yaz that do include either Zoroastrian or Zoroastrians who had converted, for example. There are a couple of examples of that. There were, of course, Zoroastrian wives of Fath Ali Shah. There were a number of them. So some of these children had Zoroastrian heritage through their mother. It's a very diverse family. You know, there are women who are Armenian, Georgian, there are Zoroastrian, Jewish, right? And he marries women purposefully from all over Iran, of course, as a kind of strategy, just as he then sends his sons, the elder sons, all over Iran. He also marries women from all over Iran to create that kind of network. So in a way, they're kind of present, even if they're not technically considered Zoroastrians. I don't work on opium, so I can't really comment on opium. Wine, I don't think there's any doubt that wine was present. At the same time, of course, you know, even from Fath Ali Shah period, I think they had not only Islamic instruction, but they also had Ashura activities for women within the royal family, right? But that wasn't necessarily seen as incompatible with other. So even if Rashha says, I don't need wine because I'm so drunk on writing poetry about Fath Ali Shah. She may or may not be telling the truth. Yeah.
Oh, first of all, this was fascinating. I have the feeling that I have always seen only the tip of the iceberg, and there is such a large chunk underneath, especially not only with the female poetry, but this period, the exploration of this. One of my questions was, there is this autobiographical element in someone who would have been supporter of poetry. She's writing too. But do you see something like that in those who were panegyrists, for example? Do they ever have something personal, or is it actually the stock phrase of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think with the way in which panegyric poets, the trope and the pattern of complaint. I mean, it's part of being a panegyrist, right? So you see a lot of that. Whether or not that's personal to them is very debatable. But I think that Masnavi by al-Saltana is in even though it's Masnavi form rather than in a lyric form, it's in the style in a way of Padishah Khatun's famous Fakhriya or Mufakhirat, right, where she boasts about herself. But here she's doing that boasting, but then kind of drawing back from the boasting to show some kind of piety and humility. But that is the Mufakhira or Fakhriya is very often a feminine tradition anyway. It's something that goes all the way back at least to Padishah Khatun and maybe even before. And it is within that kind of framework autobiographical. Yeah. It's meant to focus the attention of the listener or the reader on the self as presented by the poet, if that is autobiographical, I guess.
So when does it happen? When does this turning happen that we see in Parvin at the Samis poetry? We can see that it is female poetry.
Yes.
And this representing the female patron as a male practically.
Yeah.
When did it change? Maybe this.
Well, she does present her as a male, but she also calls her Khatun Ruzegar and Banuye Giti Madar, right? So she does do that. I mean, this is the beauty of being a female poet or praising a female patron. And again, there are brilliant examples of a whole series of panegyrics by Salman Saveji for Delshad Khatun. And they are brilliant. I often read them now with my students. Some of them are quite short as well. And in those, there is this mixture of praise of her as female and as male. And you can do that with a female patron. You can't really do it with a male patron, or rather they don't do it with a male patron. Just as a female poet, I've shown in my work on Jahan Malek Khatun that in very kind of subtle ways, they're able to play with the gender of their poetic voice, again in a way that male poets either don't do or just don't tend to do. And she does it repeatedly. So there's a kind of a facility amongst female poets, especially I think when they praise female patrons, where they are able to use a broader range of this kind of praise language. And I think you see that in what Rashha does there. So yes, she does present her in a way as though stereotypically male, but she marks her as being female, right? And she uses her, she was one of the first daughters to have a laqab, and she uses it in the poetry, and Zia Sultana herself used it. But yeah, I mean, there is this interesting kind of halfway house between male and female that you find in this kind of poetry.
You refer to it as an anthology.
Mm.
So it's very much, it seems, in the tradition of the tazkiras,
Yes.
right? Which has a very long
Yep.
history, and which also is like pretty stratified.
Mhm.
Like princes are always mentioned first. So, but the anthologizer is a male.
Yeah.
it's not female anthologized.
No.
And excuse me, I just can't remember the details, but I know there is an anthology of female.
Fakhri Heravi.
Yes.
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 So early.
Jawahar al-Asrar, yes.
No, Jawahar al-Ajayib.
Ajayib.
Yes, yeah.
Mhm.
So that too was anthologized by male.
Yes, it was.
So what are is there any relationship
Between the two?
Yeah.
Yes and no. Not all of the poets that Fakhri Heravi talks about appear in the historical part of Noql Majlis. Some of it because there's one or two of them are later anyway. It was, the difference, it is a male anthologist, but it was commissioned by his sister.
Mm-hmm.
She asked him to write it.
Yeah.
And there is, there are, I've identified, I think, 5 or 6 extant manuscripts of Noql Majlis. One of them at least suggests that she may have had a hand in the structuring of the tazkira. And some of the female poets who are living, it suggests in the way in which Mahmud Mirza has phrased it, that they may have selected what the excerpts that he presents in the anthology. So I think it's a bit more complicated than Fakhri Heravi.
Right.
I think so. Yeah. Now, he opens the anthology with a long praise poem for Fath Ali Shah and Zia al-Saltana. He praises the king first, and then he praises his sister. And again, in that kind of way of bringing those two together.
Actually, Reza Wali Khan Hidayat has a book of biographies of poets,
Mhm.
not known for Sahab.
Mhm.
I wonder if we did.
There are almost no women in there.
Women,
Yeah, there's just a couple of women. Yeah.
couple of women contemporaries or.
He has at least, yes, he has Mastura, I think. Mastura Kordestani, I think is there. Yeah. But he wasn't very interested in women, I don't think.
It's quite unusual, right? I mean, just Jawahir al-Ajayib.
Yes, yes, yes.
This is really something
Yeah,
The
different.
gems of the,
It is
yeah.
actually, yeah.
Yeah.
If there's no other questions, I think I abuse my position to ask you the last question.
Oh, please.
What makes early Qajar female poetry different, especially in terms of court poetry? Let's say with Safavids or with Ilkhanids, for example. Is there anything in early Qajar female poetry that strike you as unique or unusual compared to other dynasties that came before it?
I'm not selling my book here, but I would say no, probably there isn't. But
Okay.
I mean that's also the point of the point at of the development of the tradition, right?
So it is the same pattern that basically repeating
To a
itself
certain
in every
extent.
court.
To a certain extent, but these. I mean, people have quite rightly critiqued the much later name of the Bazgashta Adabi, and if you look at even Timurid poetry, even earlier, but if you look from Timurid poetry onwards, so much of what Timurid poetry is and everything that comes after it is imitation of what came before, right? So the idea that suddenly in the 18th century, the early 19th century, poets woke up and said, oh, we need to imitate earlier poets is, of course, a fiction. Now, what is interesting, there are a number of interesting things, but all of the poets that I look at are, when they write lyric, when they write ghazal in particular, they imitate, by and large, Hafiz, Sa'di and Maulana, right? As you would expect. Now, the way in which they do that can be more or less subtle, more or less creative, and those are the things that I teased out in my book. But at the same time, they also, and I tried to show that a little bit today, at least in my comments, they also draw on and imitate poets of the Zand period and contemporary poets who are Qajar. So they're not simply reading poetry of pre-15th century, right? And they also imitate poets of the Timurid and Safavid period. But they are aware of the poetry around them. They're aware of the poetry of the previous immediate generations, and they interact with it. They respond to it, they build upon it, they kind of critique it. So it's a much more complex picture in terms of what they are doing and how they are relating themselves to it. In terms of women poets, I think the fascinating thing is that they are everywhere when you start to look. They are in all of the contexts that I'm looking at, right? They're not anomalies. They're not ajaib. They're not, the weird and wondrous thing of the age necessarily. And of course, there is a patriarchal investment in the promotion of the idea that they are all ujube, that they are all somehow, strange anomalies that don't fit within their sex. But it's not really true when you start to actually do the work, the difficult work of bringing these voices out and bringing them together and looking at a kind of broader environment and these broader networks. So whether or not they're drastically different from what is happening before, I mean, they're greater in number, but I mean, the point of what they're doing, they wouldn't want to be necessarily seen as radically different from what had come before, right? Because if they were, they wouldn't have demonstrated their erudition and their command of the canon, which is what they're all about, right?
Wonderful. I think there is no more questions. Thank you so much for coming to Toronto, giving an excellent talk. We enjoyed it tremendously, and hopefully we're looking forward to your book launch. Hopefully in
book lunch, or there's going to be lunch?
Well, we're going to have lunch as well. Thank you, Dr. Brookshaw, for an excellent talk and a stimulating conversation.
Thank you very much.